The early morning in Washington was cold and silent when a soft, broken cry echoed through the dark alley next to an abandoned supermarket. Amid cardboard boxes and piled-up plastic bags, a small child with pale skin and round, frightened eyes was crying from hunger and cold. She was a little girl, barely 3 years old, with dark, tangled hair, wearing an oversized coat with no socks or shoes. No one knew her name or where she had come from. She was just another unknown face in the big city, a place too busy to notice when someone went missing. Those who saw her felt a mix of sadness and helplessness, but the few people who passed by were in a hurry or simply didn't know what to do. So there she stayed, huddled on the damp, dirty ground, her little hands hugging her knees, her gaze distant. Hours later, as the sun was rising and the city was waking up, an elderly woman carrying some shopping bags stopped and noticed the small, solitary figure. She approached cautiously, leaned down, and called out, "Hey, my angel, what are you doing here?" The child just looked at her fearfully, not knowing how to respond. Her voice, if she still had it, seemed to have been stifled by time and abandonment. "Where's your mommy?" the woman insisted, her eyes visibly worried. The girl lowered her gaze, curling herself even tighter, as if trying to disappear. The woman looked around, uncertain of what to do, but clearly moved by the sight of this small, vulnerable, and lonely child. "Wait here. I'm going to get some help, all right?" she said gently, trying to offer a bit of comfort to the girl. As the woman walked away to find someone who could assist, the girl watched the movement on the street, the cars, the hurried people, and it all seemed like a world so far from hers. That world wasn't hers. It was as if she were a stranger, a tiny, insignificant fragment lost among all those unfamiliar faces. Soon after, the woman returned with a man in uniform, a police officer who knelt beside the child and tried to talk to her. But the girl remained still, silent, as if she were trapped in a place far away from there. "I think we need to take her to the shelter," the officer murmured to the woman, who nodded with a sad sigh. The girl was lifted up gently, and for the first time in hours, felt the warmth of an embrace. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She just stayed quiet, like a little rag doll being carried somewhere. Along the way, the officer and the woman exchanged worried glances. The child's lack of response, her absence of any identification or personal belongings, made it clear that she had been abandoned, left out in the open with no one to care for her. And so, under a cloudy sky and on a chilly morning, the life of that unknown child continued toward an uncertain fate. The shelter would be the place where she would spend the coming days, surrounded by other children who, like her, had been left behind, forgotten in a world too big for their small hearts. At the shelter, the girl was given a warm bath, clean clothes, and a simple meal. Although the caregiver tried to be gentle, the child's empty expression remained, as if a part of her soul was lost somewhere. While the other children gathered around, curious about the new arrival, she kept staring into the void, unaffected by the movement around her. The shelter was modest, with old iron beds and peeling walls that bore the marks of time. The head caregiver, Miss Mary, a woman around 50, had dedicated her life to caring for abandoned and orphaned children. She knew that vacant look well, and with her years of experience, she understood that the girl wasn't just hungry or cold. She carried the weight of abandonment, a sadness that words couldn't capture. "Hey, sweetheart, what's your name?" Miss Mary asked as she made up the little one's bed. The girl, still lost in her gaze, murmured something inaudible, so softly it was almost a whisper. "Could you say that again, my love?" Miss Mary leaned in, trying to hear. "Laura?" she murmured in a voice so faint it nearly vanished into the air. Miss Mary smiled, though her heart tightened. Laura. Now she had a name, but that name felt fragile, as if it might disappear again at any moment. "What a beautiful name, Laura. You must be tired. You can rest here, all right?" she said with a tenderness that tried to reach the emptiness in the girl's gaze. Laura lay down, her eyes still open and fixed on a distant point. As the minutes passed, the other sounds in the shelter, the children's laughter, the footsteps of other caregivers, the doors opening and closing, began to fade, and she closed her eyes. But even then, sleep brought no peace. Through the night, she tossed and turned, waking up several times with inaudible whispers and whimpers of fear. The next morning, Miss Mary watched Laura as the children played in the yard. Laura was sitting alone, holding an old doll she had found in a basket of used toys. She didn't play like the other children. She just stroked the doll's tangled hair with a lost look in her eyes. Trying to approach her, Miss Mary sat down beside her and spoke in a low voice. "Do you like the doll, Laura?" Laura gave a small nod. The silence between them was heavy, and Miss Mary, unsure how to proceed, continued, "Do you remember where you lived? Who you were with? Dad? Mom? Any family?" Laura hesitated, clutching the doll to her chest. In a faint voice, she replied, "Mommy, she said she'd come back. But she didn't," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears before she lowered her gaze, as if she'd said something she shouldn't have. Miss Mary felt her heart ache. Laura didn't fully grasp what it meant to be abandoned. She only knew she was alone. The thought that a mother had promised to return and then disappeared stirred a mix of sadness and indignation within Miss Mary. Days passed, and Laura continued to live in that painful apathy. She didn't mingle with the other children, didn't play, ate very little, and every time a stranger entered the shelter, she would shrink back in fear. The other caregivers, like Miss Mary, noticed her isolation, but reaching her was difficult. Laura seemed to have built a wall between herself and the world, a wall of silence and sorrow. One rainy afternoon, when the children were gathered for a reading activity, Miss Mary invited Laura to sit beside her. The girl hesitated, but eventually complied, sitting down with the doll on her lap. Miss Mary opened a book and began to read a story about a lost girl who, after many adventures, found her family. It was a light, hopeful story that usually brightened the children's spirits. But when Laura heard the words about the reunion, she began to cry silently, clutching the doll close. It was as if, in those words, she saw the promise she had been waiting for. Miss Mary paused the reading, took Laura's small hand, and gently stroked her face. "Laura, sweetheart, I'm here," she said softly, hoping to somehow reach the girl's heart. Laura looked up, and for the first time, her eyes reflected something beyond emptiness, a glimmer of deep sadness, and at the same time, of hope. It was a look filled with immense pain, but also a delicate fragility that tugged at Miss Mary's heart. Sensing a small opening in Laura's heart, Miss Mary continued speaking, hoping to form a bond to bring some comfort to that wounded soul. "I know it's hard, and I know you miss your mom. But here, you're not alone. I'm here, and I'll take care of you. I won't leave you." Laura continued to cry, silently sobbing. In that moment, Miss Mary knew with certainty that the girl bore a sorrow far too heavy for her age, a sorrow no child should carry. Even so, she promised herself that as long as she was there, she would do everything possible to bring a little light to Laura's life, which seemed to exist in an endless dark night. The rain was pouring outside the shelter, and Laura, leaning against the window, watched as the droplets collected on the glass. The sound of the storm was frightening for the other children, but to her, there was something calming in that constant noise. It wasn't much different from the nights when, curled up in some hidden corner, she'd listen to people hurrying by, unaware that there was a child there, invisible. That afternoon, Miss Mary took Laura to a small counseling session within the shelter. Sitting in an armchair, the psychologist observed her with a gentle look and a soft voice, trying to ask simple questions, hoping to get closer. "Laura, you know we're here to help you, don't you?" asked the psychologist. Laura nodded, but she didn't look at the woman. The psychologist tried a few more simple questions, but each attempt to start a deeper conversation was met with a heavy, impenetrable silence. The quiet moments stretched on, and even when Laura responded, her answers were short and monosyllabic. There was no opening for dialogue. After several unsuccessful attempts, the psychologist sighed and looked at Miss Mary. "She's deeply withdrawn, Mary. It's as if she's built a cocoon around herself. We're going to need a lot of time and patience to reach her." Miss Mary only nodded, fully understanding what the psychologist meant. Laura's pain wasn't recent. It seemed rooted, like as if she had always carried the hurt of rejection. Mary knew it would be a daily struggle to help the girl, but she also knew she wouldn't give up. That night, while all the children were asleep, Laura suddenly woke up, her heart racing, her body sweaty. It had been a nightmare. In her mind were blurred images of a woman walking away, never looking back. In the dream, Laura stretched out her tiny hand, trying to reach her, but the woman kept moving, vanishing into the darkness. Feeling her heart ache, Laura got out of bed and quietly walked down the shelter's hallway until she reached Miss Mary's door. She hesitated, but after a few seconds, she knocked with her small, trembling fists. Miss Mary opened the door almost immediately, her eyes still sleepy, but when she saw Laura, she was fully awake. "Laura, what's wrong, my love?" she asked with concern, kneeling down to be at the girl's level. Laura swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She mumbled in a weak voice, I had a bad dream." Miss Mary sighed, understanding the girl's fear. Without a second thought, she lifted Laura in her arms and carried her to a soft armchair by her bed. She settled Laura on her lap, hugging her and gently running her hand through her tangled hair. "It's all right, sweetheart. I'm here with you. Nothing bad is going to happen," she whispered softly. Those words felt like a balm to Laura, who slowly began to calm down. The warmth of Miss Mary's arms and the softness of her voice were like a remedy for the emptiness she carried. Gradually, the girl relaxed, resting her head on the caregiver's shoulder, and a feeling of safety, fragile but real, surrounded her. After some time, when Laura was almost asleep, Miss Mary asked quietly, her voice hesitant, "Laura, do you remember what your home was like?" The girl shook her head slightly, her eyes half closed, unsure. "I remember a little. It was dark. It smelled like smoke, I think." Miss Mary felt a tightness in her chest. She knew many stories of children who came from troubled homes, where the environment was one of constant neglect and abandonment. But what saddened her most was the thought that, for Laura, this might be the only kind of home she'd ever known. "And did you have a bed? Any toys?" Miss Mary continued gently, trying to probe without pressuring. Laura shrugged, averting her gaze. "There was a box. I'd stay in the box when I had to hide." She said naturally, as if it were something ordinary. A lump formed in the caregiver's throat. It was too cruel an image, such a young child hiding in a box like an animal trying to escape danger. "My angel," Miss Mary murmured, holding her a little tighter, trying to push back her own tears. After a few minutes, she noticed that Laura had fallen asleep again, her face peaceful and her tiny fists clasped together, as if finally at ease. She carried her back to bed, carefully tucking her in, and before leaving, she kissed her forehead and whispered, "I promise I'll take care of you. While you're here, nothing bad will happen to you." In the days that followed, Miss Mary noticed that her bond with Laura was beginning to strengthen, though still fragile. Laura began to follow her around like a shadow, always quiet but with watchful eyes, as if she had found someone she could trust. Even so, the nights were still difficult. It was common for Laura to wake up crying, frightened, but now, instead of isolating herself, she sought Miss Mary's presence. Miss Mary would comfort her and stay by her side until she drifted back to sleep. This growing connection was, for Laura, a small light amidst her darkness. But despite all her efforts, Miss Mary knew it wasn't enough. Laura needed far more than the protection of a temporary shelter. That evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Miss Mary sat at her desk and began writing a letter. She had decided to contact an adoption agency, hoping to find a family who could give Laura the love she deserved, a true home where she could grow free from the scars of abandonment. With a heavy heart, Miss Mary carefully chose her words, describing Laura as a sweet but deeply fragile girl, a child who deserved more than the shelter could provide. She knew it would be difficult to find a family willing to face the challenges of caring for a child with so many emotional wounds, but she held on to hope. Miss Mary finished the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in an envelope, murmuring to herself, "I promise, Laura, I'll find someone who can give you a better life." Days passed, and while Miss Mary awaited a response from the adoption agency, Laura continued to struggle with her memories and fears. At the shelter, she remained a reserved and quiet child, but little by little, she began responding to the caregiver's gestures of affection and even started to participate, albeit from a distance, in activities. One afternoon, as Mary was reading to the children, Laura surprised everyone by raising her small hand and asking to share something. The children exchanged glances, and Mary, trying to hide her own surprise, encouraged her. "Of course, Laura, you can tell us whatever you want," she said with a warm smile. Laura Laura hesitated, looking down at the doll she clutched tightly, but then she began to speak in a low, hesitant voice. I had a mommy. She liked to sing a song to me. I don't remember how it went. I just remember she sang. Her voice wavered and she squeezed the doll even tighter, as if afraid the memory might slip away. Mary felt a pang in her heart. This was the first time Laura mentioned her mother directly, with some emotion. The children around her seemed touched too, some even holding back tears. Mary moved closer to Laura and gently stroked her hair. "It's wonderful that you remember that, my love. Those memories can be precious," she said, trying to keep her tone light. But inside, she felt heartbroken, seeing how much Laura longed for a presence that was no longer there. Later, when all the children were asleep, Miss Mary lay awake, thinking about Laura's words. Her memories are so small, so fragmented, she thought, feeling helpless in the face of the girl's suffering. Mary wondered what could have driven Laura's mother to abandon her like that. Was it a choice, a careless act, or maybe a necessity? That night, as she reflected on all of this, Mary decided she needed to know more about Laura's past to try to understand how to help the girl overcome her fears and trauma. The next day, she called social services and requested a visit from a caseworker, hoping they might provide some clues about the girl's family. When the caseworker arrived, Mary welcomed her into her office and offered her a seat. The caseworker, a young woman with a kind expression, seemed eager to help. "How can I help you, Miss Mary?" asked the caseworker, observing the caregiver attentively. "It's about Laura, the little 3-year-old who arrived a few weeks ago. I'd like to know if there's any information about her family or maybe someone who might be looking for her," she said, trying to hide the urgency in her voice. The caseworker sighed and opened the folder of documents she'd brought with her. She flipped through a few papers until she found what she was looking for. Unfortunately, Laura's situation is complicated. Her mother was located in a small town, but according to our records, she has no interest in regaining custody of the girl. It seems that there was a situation of abuse and neglect, she said with a somber look. The mother was young, living in very poor conditions and without family support. Mary's heart sank at hearing this. So Laura had not only been abandoned, but was possibly also a victim of an abusive situation. "She must have suffered so much," Miss Mary murmured, trying to hold back tears. The caseworker nodded with a sympathetic look. "That's why it's so important to find a family for her, someone who can provide the love and stability this girl needs. However, her situation is delicate, and it won't be easy to find a family willing to take her in, given her history of abandonment and the trauma she carries." Mary nodded silently. She had seen many children come through the shelter, and in cases like Laura's, it was common for them to face years of waiting for a family. Some, sadly, never found a permanent home. After the visit from the caseworker, Miss Mary decided not to tell Laura anything about her mother's situation. It would be too painful for such a young child to hear something so heavy. Instead, she resolved to focus even more on providing her with moments of happiness and security at the shelter. She began creating special moments for Laura, involving her in small activities, like helping in the kitchen or organizing toys. Laura seemed to enjoy helping, especially in Mary's company. One day, as the two were washing some fruit for dessert, Laura suddenly asked, "Miss Mary, why did my mommy leave?" The question struck Mary like a sharp blade. She stopped what she was doing, knelt down, and looked into the girl's eyes. "I don't know, my love, but maybe she was going through something too difficult for you to understand right now," she said gently, choosing each word carefully. "What I do know, Laura, is that you're a very special girl, and everyone here cares about you very much." Laura seemed to think, holding an apple tightly in her hands. "Do you think she'll come back?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Miss Mary hesitated, feeling the weight of that question. She knew she couldn't give Laura the answer she longed for, but she also knew the girl needed hope, something to warm her wounded heart. "I don't know, Laura, but while she's not here, I promise to take care of you. I'll do everything I can to make sure you feel happy and loved, okay?" Laura nodded slowly, as if that promise offered her some comfort. There was still a shadow of sadness in her eyes, but she seemed a little lighter, perhaps reassured by the feeling that in that moment, she wasn't completely alone. In the days that followed, Miss Mary observed with joy the small changes in Laura. She began to smile, albeit shyly, and started interacting more with the other children. Though still more reserved than the others, she showed a desire to belong, to feel part of something bigger. With each of Laura's new accomplishments, Miss Mary's heart filled with pride and affection, but at the same time, her anxiety about the adoption agency's response grew. With each passing day, she feared that no family would accept Laura, that her difficult past would prevent her from having a new chance. Mary knew that, despite the shelter's efforts, it was not an ideal place for a child's growth, especially for one as vulnerable as Laura. Then, on a cold Friday morning, a letter arrived. It was from the adoption agency. Mary sat down, holding the envelope in her hands, and took a deep breath before opening it. Her heart was racing. As she unfolded the letter and read the first few lines, her eyes widened. A family was interested in meeting Laura. Tears welled up in her eyes as she finished reading. It was a family who, according to their profile, had previously adopted another child and had experience with children in vulnerable situations. They seemed perfect for Laura, but Mary knew the transition would be a challenge. Laura was just beginning to open up, to feel safe, and now she would have to face another change, another separation. With a heart torn between joy and fear, Mary knew she would need to prepare Laura as best as possible for meeting the new family. That night, while all the children slept, Miss Mary reflected in silence. The joy of knowing a family was interested in Laura was clouded by worry. How would such a fragile girl, who was just beginning to recover from abandonment, handle this change? Mary knew that, although Laura had improved, her heart still held a deep insecurity and a constant fear of being left behind. The next morning, she decided to start a gentle conversation with Laura, planting the idea that one day, perhaps, she might live in a new home. During breakfast, as the other children were getting up, Mary asked Laura to sit next to her. The girl looked curious and a bit worried, but she settled in, holding her worn doll as she always did in moments of uncertainty. "Laura, did you know that some children at the shelter find families who take them to live with them?" Mary began, her tone light and almost casual. Laura nodded, though she looked confused. "Some children find a new home where they can have a family, a dad, a mom, maybe even siblings. There are people who take care of them, love them, and protect them," Mary explained, watching each of Laura's reactions. The girl stayed silent, processing Mary's words. After a moment, she murmured, "But what if they don't like me?" The question made Mary's heart ache. She took Laura's small hand, holding it gently. "Oh, my dear, who wouldn't like you? You're special, Laura, and this family that wants to meet you, well, they already know how amazing you are. They chose you because they know you have a big, kind heart," Mary replied, smiling. Laura looked away, fiddling with her doll's hair with anxious fingers. The idea of having a family sounded nice, but it was also scary. After so many months of bonding with Miss Mary in the shelter, imagining a new life was confusing and unsettling. A few days went by, and Laura began to have more frequent conversations with Mary about the idea of a new home. Mary was patient, explaining that having a new family didn't mean she would stop being loved or be forgotten. She reassured Laura that she could always visit the shelter, that she would always have a place in her heart. Gradually, these words seemed to give the girl a bit of security, a foundation to face her fear of the unknown. Finally, the day of the family's visit arrived. Mary dressed Laura in a light blue dress, fixed her hair, and took her to the garden, where the couple awaited with warm smiles. They seemed kind, with gentle expressions and attentive eyes. The woman's name was Chloe, and the man's was Richard. They had a welcoming manner that helped ease some of Laura's anxiety. Sensing the girl's tension, Mary knelt down and whispered in her ear, "It's okay, Laura. I'll be here with you the whole time." Laura nodded, squeezing Mary's hand as she took her first timid steps toward the couple. Chloe knelt down to Laura's level and gave a calm smile. "Hi, Laura. My name is Chloe. It's such a pleasure to meet you," the woman said, extending her hand. Laura looked at Mary, who nodded with a smile, and then shook Chloe's hand, though still a bit hesitant. Richard also greeted her gently, respecting her space and not pushing her. During the conversation, Chloe and Richard showed some pictures of their home and of the child they had already adopted, a 5-year-old girl named Sophia. Chloe explained warmly that Sophia was excited to meet a new sister and had even set aside some toys just for Laura. Laura's heart was racing as she looked at the photos and listened to their story. She was still frightened, but something in Chloe and Richard's calm, affectionate voices made her let her guard down, even if just a little. They talked about simple things like favorite toys and games, with Mary by her side, encouraging Laura to answer and share her interests. After a while, Richard suggested they all go for ice cream at the nearby park. Mary agreed, and they walked together, Sera, with Mary close to Laura, offering the reassurance she needed. At the ice cream shop, Chloe ordered chocolate ice cream, and Laura, still shy, chose the same flavor, watching each gesture of the new family carefully, as if trying to decipher what they truly wanted. As they enjoyed their ice cream, Chloe started talking softly about life at home. At our house, we like to play outside a lot, and Sophia loves to draw. Maybe you and she could draw together sometime. How does that sound? Chloe asked, smiling. Laura gave a small nod, still without words. The idea of having someone to play with was tempting, but the shadow of fear lingered. Chloe noticed her hesitation and, without pushing, continued speaking, allowing Laura to take in each word at her own pace. At the end of the visit, Mary walked Laura back to the shelter while Chloe and Richard said their goodbyes, promising to return for another visit. On the way back, Mary asked, "How did you feel with them, Laura? Did you enjoy spending time with Chloe and Richard?" Laura thought for a moment, clutching her doll tightly to her chest. "I liked it, but will they leave too?" she asked, her voice trembling. The question tore at Mary's heart. She knew that abandonment was a wound that would never fully heal, that it would always leave its marks. Smiling gently, Mary said, "They don't want to leave you, Laura. They want you to go with them, to be part of their family. They want to give you a home forever." Laura fell silent, absorbing those words. The promise of forever sounded sweet but distant, almost like a dream she was afraid to believe in. Even so, for the first time, a glimmer of hope began to appear in her eyes. In the following days, Chloe and Richard returned to the shelter several times. Each visit was a chance for Laura to build more trust, to grow accustomed to their presence. Gradually, she allowed herself to smile around them, play a little more, and even show them some of the drawings she made for them. Finally, Chloe and Richard decided to invite her for a weekend at their home, an opportunity for Laura to experience a little of what her new life could be like. Mary was thrilled with the progress, but also anxious, knowing this would be a crucial moment. On Friday, Chloe and Richard arrived at the shelter to pick Laura up. She was visibly nervous, gripping her doll tightly and looking at Mary. Seeing her fearful expression, Mary hugged her tightly, whispering, "It's going to be all right, my love. I'll be here when you come back. Have fun, play, and enjoy your time with them." Laura nodded with tears in her eyes, trusting Vera's words despite her fears. Holding Chloe's hand, she walked to the car, where Richard waited with an encouraging smile. The drive was quiet, but Chloe and Richard gave Laura her space, not pushing her to talk. When they arrived at the house, Laura was greeted enthusiastically by Sophia, who ran up to her with a big smile, holding one of the toys she had set aside. "Hi! Are you Laura? I'm Sophia," said the girl with the ease and joy of a child who simply wants a new friend. Laura smiled shyly, feeling a small spark of happiness at Sophia's excitement. The two began to play together, under the watchful and emotional eyes of Chloe and Richard, who felt hopeful seeing the beginnings of a bond between the two girls. That night, after many games, Chloe helped Laura get ready to sleep in a room decorated with special touches just for her, with soft blankets and a nightlight that projected stars onto the ceiling. As Chloe tucked her in and gave her a goodnight kiss, Laura whispered, "Do you promise I can stay here?" Chloe held Laura's hand and replied sincerely, "I promise, Laura. This can be your home." Laura closed her eyes, hugging her doll, her heart racing but filled with a new, warm feeling, the hope that maybe she had finally found a forever home. The weekend with Chloe, Richard, and Sophia felt like a dream for Laura. On Saturday, they had a picnic in the backyard, where Sophia, with her contagious energy, taught Laura how to jump rope and play hide and seek. For the first time in months, Laura felt like she was part of a family. A bittersweet yet comforting feeling. Chloe and Richard were gentle, never pressuring her, but always present, offering support and kindness in every small gesture. On Sunday evening, when it was time to return to the shelter, Laura was quiet, her face somber, holding Chloe's hand. On the way back, Chloe watched her through the rearview mirror, trying to hold back her own emotions. She knew that going back to the shelter would be hard for Laura, especially now that she had experienced the warmth of a home. When they arrived at the shelter, Miss Mary was already waiting at the door, visibly emotional. As soon as Laura saw her, she let go of Chloe's hand and ran into Mary's arms. They stood there for a few moments, saying nothing, just holding each other. Chloe and Richard watched the scene with understanding and affection, knowing that Mary was Laura's rock, and it wouldn't be easy for her to let go. Inside the shelter, after saying goodbye to Chloe and Richard, Miss Mary and Laura sat on one of the beds. Mary gently stroked Laura's hair as the girl clutched her doll tightly, as if afraid of losing everything she had just experienced. "Were they nice to you?" Mary asked softly. Laura nodded, her gaze distant as she processed her conflicting emotions. "They let me play, gave me a room with starlights," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Sophia said she wants to be my sister. But I. Her voice faded and she lowered her head, tears quietly falling. "My dear, I know this is scary. It's a big change, and change can be frightening," Mary said, gently holding Laura's face so she would look her in the eyes. "But I feel that Chloe and Richard are good people. They want you to be part of their family. They want to give you the love and care you deserve." Laura shook her head, sobbing as she tried to understand. The fear of being abandoned again consumed her. Even with all the kindness from Chloe and Richard, a huge doubt lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. And if they leave too?" she murmured, almost like a lament. Miss Mary held Laura's small hands firmly, giving her the security she needed. "I believe they're not going anywhere, Laura. They're ready to be your family. But this decision is yours, my love. You need to feel safe. You need to be ready for this new step," Mary said, her voice filled with emotion. "And I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Laura looked at Mary, and a small, hesitant smile appeared on her lips. The caregiver returned the smile, gently stroking her hair, thinking about Chloe and Richard's next visit, already scheduled for the following week. In the days that followed, Laura seemed to live in a mixture of anxiety and hope. She constantly asked Mary when Chloe and Richard would return, and whenever a door opened or someone new arrived at the shelter, her eyes lit up with expectation. Finally, the day came, and Chloe and Richard arrived at the shelter to pick up Laura again. This time, Laura's smile when she saw them was more open and genuine, and she ran into Chloe's welcoming embrace. The three of them returned home, where Sophia was waiting excitedly, holding a box of toys to share with Laura. Over the weekend, Chloe and Richard decided to have an honest conversation with Laura about adoption. After dinner, when Sophia was already in bed, they sat with Laura in the living room, creating a warm and safe environment. "Laura, we want to talk to you about something important," Chloe said, holding her small hand. Laura looked at them, her big, attentive eyes unsure of what they meant. "We'd like you to be part of our family, for real. We want you to be our daughter, just like Sophia is our daughter, too," Richard explained, trying to make the words easy for Laura to understand. Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Chloe for confirmation. Does that mean I can stay? Forever?" she asked, her voice trembling. Chloe smiled, wiping away the tears on the girl's cheeks. "Yes, Laura, we want you to stay forever. We want to take care of you, to love you, and to always be by your side," Chloe said, with a tenderness that made Laura's heart beat a little faster. Laura stayed quiet for a few moments, taking in those words. Then, in a gesture of trust, she hugged Chloe and Richard at the same time, crying with emotion and relief. Finally, her heart was beginning to believe that this promise could be true. The next morning, back at the shelter, Laura ran to Mary with a smile on her face and shared everything with an enthusiastic voice. "They want me to be their daughter, Miss Mary. They said I can stay." Miss Mary held Laura in her arms, tears of happiness in her eyes. She hugged the girl tightly, trying to hide the mix of joy and sadness she was beginning to feel. "Oh, my dear, you deserve all the happiness in the world. I'm so happy for you, so proud, Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. This family will take such good care of you. But I'll always be here, always be your friend, and I'll be wishing for you to have a beautiful life. In the days that followed, Mary and the shelter staff prepared Laura for her final departure. It was a joyful moment for everyone, but also a sad one. Every caregiver who knew Laura's story felt moved as they watched her leave, wishing her a life filled with love and new, happy memories. Finally, moving day arrived. Chloe and Richard came to pick up Laura with all the paperwork in hand, ready to take her to her new home. Before leaving, Mary hugged Laura one last time, struggling to hold back her tears. You're going to be so happy, my dear, and I'll always be here whenever you need, she said, feeling a tightness in her chest from the anticipation of missing her. Still wrapped in Mary's embrace, Laura whispered, I'll never forget you, Miss Mary. Never. Miss Mary nodded, gently stroking the girl's face one last time before letting her go. Chloe, Richard, and Laura left the shelter, heading toward a new life. Along the way, Laura held Chloe's hand tightly, her heart still racing, but this time not with fear. It was with hope. She looked out the car window, feeling as if her life was finally beginning, like a new blank page, ready to be filled with love, safety, and belonging. When she arrived at her new home, Laura found Sophia waiting with a big smile and a warm hug. The family was finally complete, and Laura, though with lingering traces of fear, began to feel something she never thought possible. The sense that this time, she had found a home where she could, at last, be happy forever. The first days in her new home were a mix of discovery and adjustment for Laura. She still had the habit of waking up in the middle of the night, her eyes wide with fear, worried that it was all a dream, that Chloe, Richard, and Sophia would disappear at any moment. But on each of those nights, Chloe was always there, ready to soothe her and reassure her that everything was okay. You're safe here, Laura. We'll never leave you, Chloe would repeat gently, holding her close until Laura drifted back to sleep. Gradually, Laura began settling into the new routine, the school she'd started attending, and family moments. She and Sophia became inseparable, playing together in the backyard, drawing, and creating stories for Sophia's many dolls. With each game, Laura started to experience the childhood she had never truly known. Little by little, this home was becoming not just a house, but a safe haven. Even so, there were moments when the fear of abandonment still haunted her. She avoided talking about her past, and when Chloe or Richard asked, she would look away, feeling uncomfortable. One day, while Chloe and Laura were alone in the kitchen, Chloe decided to gently address the topic, sensing that it was time to help Laura face her past. Laura, you know that whenever you're ready, you can tell me about what you went through, right? You don't have to keep it all to yourself, Chloe said as she chopped some fruit for the girls' snack. Laura watched Chloe's movements, hesitant. It was still hard to talk about her old life, about the cold, lonely nights, about the constant fear that no one wanted her. But slowly, she felt she could trust this new mom, who always showed her love and patience. I had a mom before, she said, almost in a whisper, her eyes fixed on the counter. Chloe stopped what she was doing and looked at Laura with understanding, giving her space to continue. She told me she would come back, but she never did. I kept waiting, but no one came. And then I was alone, she finished, her voice trembling as tears began to roll down her cheeks. Chloe's heart ached as she moved closer and hugged Laura, letting her cry and release that silent pain. Chloe knew that the wounds of abandonment wouldn't heal easily, but at that moment, she was determined to be the support Laura so deeply needed. I'm so sorry for all that you went through, my dear, but you'll never go through that again. I promise. We promise, Chloe said, gently holding Laura's hand. You have a family now, and we're going to love you and care for you forever. Chloe's words brought immense relief to Laura, who nestled into her new mother's embrace, feeling truly protected and loved. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Laura went to Chloe and Richard's room and whispered, "Can I call you Mom?" Chloe, her eyes welling with tears, nodded with emotion. Of course, sweetheart. You can call me Mom anytime you want. From that day on, Laura started calling them Mom and Dad. Each time she spoke those words, a piece of her pain was softened, and her trust in her new family grew. She felt that she belonged, that she finally had a home where she was loved and cared for. A few weeks later, Chloe and Richard decided it was time to make the adoption official. The paperwork involved was still extensive, but they were determined to ensure that Laura would be their daughter in every way possible. Laura, on her part, was curious, wondering what it meant to be officially adopted. Chloe explained patiently that with the adoption, Laura would legally become their daughter, and it meant she would stay with them forever. The days leading up to the adoption hearing were tense. Though Laura was excited, she still had fears that something might go wrong, that some small detail would take her away from Chloe, Richard, and Sophia. It was as if her fragile heart was afraid to fully believe in happiness. The night before the hearing, Chloe came into Laura's room and sat beside her on the bed. "Are you excited for tomorrow?" Chloe asked, stroking Laura's hair. "Yes, but I'm also scared. What if someone says I can't stay?" Laura replied, her voice almost a whisper. Chloe held her small hand, giving all the reassurance she could. "Nothing is going to separate us, my dear. Tomorrow is just a formality. You're already our daughter in our hearts, but we want it to be official too," Chloe explained, with a gentle smile. Laura nodded, comforted by Chloe's words. And that night, for the first time in a long time, she slept deeply, cradled by the warmth of the home she had finally found. The next day, the family prepared early for the hearing. Laura wore a new dress, chosen especially for the occasion, and as she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt beautiful and cherished. Noticing her anxiety, Richard took her hand and guided her to the car with an encouraging smile. In the courtroom, Laura sat between Chloe and Richard, her eyes taking in every detail. The judge observed the family carefully, and after a few formalities, she turned to Laura with a gentle smile. "Laura, do you understand that Chloe and Richard want you to be their daughter forever?" the judge asked kindly. Laura nodded, her eyes shining with hope. "Yes, I want to be their daughter forever," she replied, her voice steady. The judge smiled and looked at Chloe and Richard. "Then it is my pleasure to declare that the adoption is officially complete. Congratulations to all of you," she said with a smile. In that moment, Laura hugged Chloe and Richard tightly, finally feeling that this was her family, that she now had a safe and loving home. As she held her new parents, Laura felt that all the fear, suffering, and loneliness she had experienced were finally fading away. Chloe and Richard held her with equal intensity, deeply moved by the significance of that moment. Sophia, holding Laura's hand, smiled as she saw her new sister fully embraced by the family and promised that from then on, they would have many adventures and play together. Upon leaving the courthouse, the family went straight to celebrate. Richard suggested they go to the park, where they spent the afternoon laughing, playing, and picnicking together. For the first time, Laura had no doubt that this moment was real. Laura's life took a new turn after the adoption hearing. Now, each day was a chance to build happy memories with her new family, memories that slowly erased the marks of her past. She no longer woke up in the middle of the night fearing abandonment. Instead, she slept peacefully, knowing she had a mom and dad ready to protect her. The trust and love of Chloe, Richard, and Sophia were like an anchor that kept her secure, even when occasional traces of fear appeared. As the months passed, Laura integrated more and more. At school, she began making new friends, joined activities, and even became interested in learning to play the piano, like her adoptive mother, Chloe. Seeing her daughter's interest, Chloe decided to enroll her in private lessons, and before long, Laura could play a few simple songs, her pride shining through her smile. Sophia and Laura, in turn, became almost inseparable. They shared secrets, games, and dreams, and whenever they could, they invented new adventures in the backyard. For Richard and Chloe, watching the friendship between the girls was the ultimate proof that Laura had truly found a home. The girl who once had a fearful and uncertain look now showed a lively spirit, radiating happiness that touched everyone around her. One spring morning, as the family enjoyed breakfast on the porch, Laura approached Chloe and Richard, holding a drawing she had made with care and dedication. On the paper was a colorful house with a smiling family: Chloe, Richard, Sophia, and herself. Above, in large, shaky letters, Laura had written, "My Forever Family." Chloe and Richard's eyes filled with tears as they looked at the drawing. Chloe picked Laura up and hugged her tightly. That's exactly what we are, Laura. Your forever family, Chloe said, her voice choked with emotion, and we're so lucky to have you with us. Laura smiled, resting her head on Chloe's shoulder, feeling loved in a way she had never imagined. As she hugged her new mom, she finally understood that, yes, she had found a place in the world where she was accepted, protected, and loved. From that day on, Laura's drawing held a special place in the living room, in a frame that Chloe and Richard had chosen with care. Every time they passed by it, they smiled, reminded of the importance of each member of their family. Years went by, and the bond between Laura and her new family grew stronger each day. Chloe and Richard supported her in every achievement and were always there during difficult times. And as Laura grew older, she held on to Chloe's promise. She would never be alone again. As an adult, Laura began visiting the shelter where she had once lived, bringing gifts and spending time with the children, especially those who, like her once, were waiting for a family. She felt that this was her way of giving back the love and care she had received, and with every smile she saw, every hug she gave, she remembered her own story and the transformation that genuine love had brought into her life. Laura knew that her path had been marked by pain and the sorrow of abandonment, but she also knew that the love of Chloe, Richard, and Sophia had healed the wounds in her heart. And today, as she looked back, she felt proud for having found the strength to believe, despite the pain, that she too deserved happiness. Thus, Laura's story was not just about the suffering she once endured, but about the strength of love, hope, and the transformative power of a family that chose to love her forever. If you enjoyed Laura's story, let us know in the comments. See you next time.